guys? This is Confessions from an Entrepreneur. I'm your host, Ash Kumra. Today's guest is Brad Feld. Many of you know who Brad is, but if you don't, he is an uber successful venture capitalist. He is one of the managing partners at the Foundry Group. Most notably, also, Brad has written many awesome, successful entrepreneurship books. He is one of the biggest community activists that you will find in the entrepreneur scene. He's on the board of organizations like Up Global, NC Wit, and he has backed many awesome companies. And, you know, this whole interview is all about understanding the mindset of what it takes to become an uber successful investor and also entrepreneur like Brad is. And yeah, so let's just get into it. So Brad, really curious, why are you a venture capitalist?
I learned a while ago that I much prefer being in a role where I'm supporting the entrepreneur versus a role where I'm the CEO. So I ran a company that I started from 1987 to 1993, and I was president. We didn't have a CEO because we didn't know what a CEO was back then. And I was a good leader of that business, and I think we had a successful and a strong business. But I after 6 or 7 years, maybe after 5 years, I realized I didn't love the work of being a CEO. 94 to 96, I made about 40 angel investments while I worked for the company that had bought my first company, which was a large public company. So I had the experience of that, which I knew was not my life work. And what I found was that in those 40 angel investments, I loved being involved at the creation process and early on in the life of a company, but I also loved not sitting in the CEO seat. And that evolved accidentally into helping start a venture capital fund and ending up being a VC, which, over a period of time, I've gotten very comfortable with that role. But it wasn't really the first venture fund I co-founded in 1996. It wasn't really until 2001 when I realized that I had to choose either being an operator or being an investor, because even in 2001, I was still co-chairman or chairman of a number of companies. Those companies were ones that I was an investor in. And the role dynamics between chairman and CEO were often confusing and in some cases distressing, because there were 2 cases, both public companies, where we fired the CEO, and I became effectively, as the co-chairman, the acting CEO until we hired a new CEO. By 2002, my whole world blew up in 2001, 2002 because of the internet bubble. And my really bad year was 2001. I made a conscious decision at that point that for the duration, I was really going to be on the investor side, and that I had a single point of view on a decision I wanted to make about a company, which is, as long as I supported the CEO, I worked for him or her. And what that meant varied from person to person, but my job was to help that person become successful as a CEO and the company to be successful. If at some point I did not support the CEO for some reason, it was my responsibility to take action on it, which did not mean fire the person and replace them. It meant do something to confront the issue that I no longer supported the person, which could result ultimately in them getting fired and replaced, or could result in us getting back to a good place where I supported her again, or me disengaging from the company for a variety of different reasons.
So I'm curious. So thank you for that answer. I learned so much insight. First off, the role between what it takes to be a CEO and the role of being an investor, and I would call it a guide for CEOs and other founders involved and executives of companies. What makes a great CEO from your experience of working with so many of them?
Well, there's a very classic Fred Wilson post that I quote all the time, which is that great CEOs do lots and lots of different things. But to be a successful CEO, you have to do 3 things. So price of admission for being a great CEO is the following three things. The first is to carry the vision of the company around, articulate the vision, share it continually with all stakeholders in the business inside and out, and be the one that is carrying that mission and that vision of the business. The second is get the right people on the team. And the third is don't ever run out of money. So as a CEO, you can't be a great CEO unless you do those three things. If you do those three things, there are many, many, many other things that great CEOs do, but they vary quite widely. But that's the overlap point.
How has the entrepreneurship scene overall changed since you first became a venture capitalist and you first got into post investing in 40 companies plus? How has entrepreneurship changed? Because I know you work with so many organizations like Up Global. You've invested in a wide variety of companies. As of this interview, Fitbit's getting a lot of attention right now as an example, and that was a company that's been over 8 years old. Like, how have you seen entrepreneurship change?
Well, so I started my first company in 1987. Roughly I've been at this for almost 30 years in different forms. I think the essence of entrepreneurship at its really fundamental core is timeless, which is the notion that one or a couple of human beings create something entirely from scratch and then instantiate that in a company and over time at different levels build the company. Fundamentally, that's what it is. There's a huge difference in it environmentally. So in 1987, we had no web. There were no books about entrepreneurship. Nobody used the word entrepreneurship. There was no sense of really how to do it in a way other than a couple of textbooks and this notion of writing a business plan and a lot of conventional wisdom that was handed down. So the activity of entrepreneurship was reasonably isolated from the mainstream of society. We're at the other end of that spectrum today, and in fact, it's so far at the other end of the spectrum, not just in terms of information that's available and communication, but the way that entrepreneurship and the constructs are woven into the fabric of society. And a lot of it is the shift in the way that people work and interact with each other. And I talk about this a lot in my book, Startup Communities. It's a big part of that is the shift from a very hierarchical mode of kind of everything to a very network-driven mode, which we're all very comfortable with as individuals because of using technology for social networks like LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter. But more importantly, understanding that that's how we interact with each other as humans in a way that is very, very effective, very rapid, very fluid. So I think we're in a very, very significant sociological shift in how people think about and engage with each other on the process of creating new things, on the process of work, on the process of what's satisfying. And it's against the backdrop that the fundamental essence is no different.
What is a company or two that comes to mind when you're describing an entrepreneur success story? That's what I'm looking for. Is they've evolved, like their strategy or the way they view the world, or just the overall business has shifted because you've invested in some companies that are quite old, at least in startup, early stage tech kind of years, 5-10 years plus, right? Is there anything that comes to mind? Any of those companies you want to share about? You don't have to say name if you don't want. You can just say this company if it's sensitive.
I'm happy to share names. There's a long list. Two that immediately come to mind as interesting. One that's the entrepreneur had an incredible personal journey of growth and development, and is someone I'm very, very proud to have worked with and have watched his own growth and development, and consider a friend and somebody who I'd worked with over and over again, sort of on anything, is Bree Pettis. Bree was the founder and CEO, co-founder and CEO of MakerBot. He was one of three founders. And when MakerBot was acquired a couple of years later by Stratasys, which is a large public company, Bree was still CEO, but he was the only of the original three founders who were still active in the company. And Bree's when I invested in MakerBot, it was, I don't know, 20 people and mostly in a warehouse in a thing called the Bot Cave in Brooklyn. And Bree and his co-founders were incredibly forward-thinking. They had great vision. They had created some incredible stuff around 3D printing and consumerizing 3D printing to the desktop. And they were fearless, but Bree's level of maturity as a leader and a CEO was very weak. And it was very weak not because of anything other than he hadn't done it, right? He hadn't been through the crucible of that role. And it was extraordinary to work with and watch him because of his skills and his ability to grow and learn and his willingness to tackle difficult stuff, but also to learn from people around him as this business grew and scaled up quite remarkably in a pretty short period of time. The other example I'd give that comes immediately to mind is a company called Return Path. That is a company started in 1999 by Matt Blumberg was the founding CEO, and Matt is still the CEO of Return Path. So I don't know if we're going on 15 or 16 years. I guess 16 years. And the company's still a private company. It's a large company. It's about 500 people. It's a successful business. It dominates the market it's in. It's got a very, very compelling long-term arc. But it's been through many, many, many ups and downs along the way. And Matt, as a CEO who, he writes a blog called Only Once. It's worth looking at. Only Once. I think it's onlyones.com, or just type Matt Blumberg. And he named the blog Only Once because you can only be a first-time CEO one time. And he's been a first-time CEO now for 16 years. Matt's become one of my best friends. I love working with him. We don't agree on everything, but we've had lots of shared life experiences. And I'd like to think that, again, in my role that I talked about in the very first few minutes of this podcast, of really viewing it as supporting the CEO. In the case of Matt, it's been a delight because he's continued to grow as a human, as a CEO, as a leader, alongside the company over a very long period of time.
One of the patterns I heard from the both examples, which were awesome examples, is there's a lot of resilience and pivoting. When is it enough for a company to pivot? Like, how many times is enough, or is there just no formula for that?
There's no formula. I mean, this shit's hard and it changes constantly, and you have internal forces, things that you fuck up and make mistakes or make bad calls or difficult judgments or assumptions that turn out to be false. And then you have external or exogenous factors. It could be, things ranging from the global macro environment to behavior of a competitor that you can't control to, the funding environment, all kinds of stuff that's happening continually through the life of a company. And I think the really great entrepreneurs, it's not that you're comfortable with it. I mean, you have great days and you have terrible days. And when you wake up in the morning, sometimes you know whether it's going to be a terrible day. You rarely know whether it's going to be a great day. And if it's a great day, at the end of the day, you just breathe a sigh of relief before you go to bed. It's just hard. And this idea that, the word pivot is it's a very useful word. It's, in the category of fail fast. It's part of the lexicon of lean startup, which has really been popularized by Eric Ries, which I think was a huge, huge, huge service to entrepreneurs. But the word pivot also becomes cliche-ish, right? Every time a company makes a decision or tries something and it doesn't work, that's a pivot. And it depends what you mean. I mean, a company is a continual process of experiments, many of which fail, and you learn from the failed experiments and try new ones. So are those pivots? Or is the pivot you were going down path A and you decided that simply wasn't working and you were going to do something totally different with whatever money you had left? And I'll give you an example of what I consider a pivot. I'm an investor now in a company called Mattermark, and the founders of Mattermark, Danielle, Kevin, and Andy. Originally, Danielle and Kevin started a company called Referly. And Referly went through YC, I don't remember the year, raised some angel money, raised some money from 500 startups. It sort of got off on a path. And at some point, Danielle and Kevin decided that Referly wasn't working. And they basically fired everyone. They joined forces with Andy. They took some of the money they had and took a year-long lease on an apartment in San Francisco, just the three of them. It was a live-work place. And they decided that they were going to spend a year and use what they had left to either turn the business into something, create something new that was interesting or not. And out of that came Mattermark. And so the original investors in Referly are investors in Mattermark. They didn't shut it down and start a new company. But they used that remaining capital to come up with what is, I think, an incredibly interesting business that they just sort of played around with stuff until they found something they loved, and then that people cared about, and then they accelerated from there. That's a pivot.
Well, speaking of pivoting, I want to pivot to another subject, which is similar to when does a company shift this decision. As of this podcast, there's a lot of companies from 2014, 15. Well, I should just say starting from Facebook upwards, there's a lot of companies that are becoming public. And some people say that, there's this renaissance of, either going public or constantly raising money as a private company so your valuation gets higher and higher. As of this podcast, there's companies like Uber and Pinterest and other, huge, what we call unicorns that are worth tens of 20, if not 30, 40, 50 billion dollars. Do you have any comment on this whole IPO versus staying private kind of discussion?
Well, I think it's, I think it'll play out over a long period of time. And I think it has a lot to do with capital supply and archetype of approach to building essentially sustainable long-term businesses. It's very, very easy from the outside looking in to make some assertions about what's going on. And I think most of the assertions are likely too narrow and too locked in a snapshot in time. And what I mean by that is, it's an interesting story 5-10 years from now versus an interesting story when you're in the middle of it. The IPO market is interesting. It's easy to say that the IPO market is vibrant and doing great, but there's actually still not that many IPOs, certainly relative to the scale and size of companies today. And it's easy to sort of then come down on the other side of it and say, well, companies are waiting longer to go public because, they just want the availability of private capital. They just want to be bigger and bigger. And that's true in some cases, but there's an awful lot of companies that have raised now a lot of private capital, which I would predict won't ever be successful companies. And so you have this, phenomena that when you're in the middle of it, it's easy to prognosticate about the drivers. But it's only on reflection looking back, in the same way that there historically have been plenty of public companies that, ended up being very long-term and durable businesses. Google, Facebook, go down the list of the current crop, or, go back and look even in the late 90s at companies that, went public in the mid to late 90s that are still significant durable businesses. And then there are plenty of companies that went public and then got bought by somebody else. There are other companies that went public and went out of business. So I think it's something that for entrepreneurs, especially at the early stages, I would say do your best to block out all that because it's just noise. and focus instead on your product and your customer and doing something really productive and valuable, rather than worrying about trying to over optimize or emulate or look like something else.
Okay, no, that's really good advice, and I know our viewers are really going to appreciate that insight. My final question to you, Brad, is where do you see the future? Like, what are some industries out there that you feel are either on the verge of blowing up, or you feel like there's a lot of stuff happening and there's a lot of room for it? For instance, Uber is a great example of an industry which is blown up, but there's still a large market for other type of Uber type, services. I mean, what excites you? I'm just curious.
Yeah, as investors, my partners and I at Foundry Group don't really care about the latest hot thing. Our approach is a much longer arc, so that the themes that we get obsessed about and that we care about are themes where we believe over the next 20 or 30 years there are continuous investment opportunities and continuous opportunities to create companies. The one I'm most intrigued with, and I probably have the most of the investments that I've led the most number in, is a theme we call human-computer interaction, which is based on the premise that the way humans and computers are going to interact with each other will be radically different 20 years from now as compared to today, in the same way that if you look at today going back 20 or 30 years, it's radically different than how it was then. I actually think the pace of change has been steadily accelerating as we continue to build more and more base of hardware and software upon which to build. And I think we're within striking distance of a very interesting shift where there's a much tighter linkage between humans and computers. And I don't know whether it's 20 years or 40 years from now, but the notion that we'll be talking about human-enhanced computers or computer-enhanced humans, and maybe not even being able to differentiate between the two, is where I like to spend my time. And that translates in terms of investments into things like Oblong, that was founded by John Underkoffler, who was a science and tech advisor for Minority Report, and created all the user experience that you saw in that movie. It's translated into now a very sizable and very rapidly growing company that's transforming the way people collaborate. Companies like Sphero, which started off with a robotic ball you control with your smartphone. They have a second robot called Ollie. The third product they're coming out with, which will launch this fall, is called BB-8, which some people may recognize as the new robot in the upcoming Star Wars movie. We believe it's the R2-D2 of this generation. And you could call them a robotics company, but fundamentally their long-term vision is changing the interaction between humans and robots, and incorporating robots not just as toys but into our daily life. In the same way, on a sort of different vector that iRobot did with the Roomba, when that company was, I think, when it first came out with the Roomba, there was plenty of chuckles about the idea of a robotic vacuum cleaner, and it's ended up being one of the most successful robotic products ever. So it's that kind of world that I like to wander around, and I have plenty of other types of investments, a lot in a theme we call glue, which is machine-to-machine interaction, software that helps connect computing technologies together. In the 1980s, it might have been called middleware. And then we also have a lot of investments around a theme we call protocol, which is companies built on top of technology protocols. Return Path, which I mentioned earlier, would be in that theme. It's a company that's built around email, which is built on the protocol SMTP. We have a big investment in a company called SendGrid, which is a leader in transactional email. We have an investment in a company in Portland called Urban Airship, again in protocol, which is around push notification. And you sort of go through those types of things, and you can either say they're exciting or they're not, but they're arcs that we believe are very, very durable as investors for a long period of time. Just as a last comment on that, right? Fitbit, which you mentioned earlier, that's in our human-computer interaction theme, the notion of human instrumentation, and the idea that we'll be tracking all kinds of things about our body and having that automatically collected. MakerBot, 3D printing, human-computer interaction, the idea that you can put literally a 3D printer on your desk. I don't know if you remember the Jetsons, but there was in the Jetsons this thing that I refer to as the Matterport. It's like a port for your vacuum cleaner in the wall. You open it up and stuff comes out of it. You just basically can say what you want, and the Matterport, creates I need a chair. Okay, here's my chair. That kind of stuff, which is the science fiction of the past, is very rapidly becoming the technology of the current.
I kind of just want to expand on that, the whole human-computive, technology aspect, and you mentioned Fitbit again. I'm just curious because right now there's so many opportunities for at least I'm talking from a mobile experience, like connectivity with. You can get your heart rate checked. You can get, your physical, if you go for a run, like a triathlon or whatever, you can get all the caloric and how much your metabolic, intake is. I mean, is there some opportunities in that side of the world that fascinate you?
Well, I mean, there's a long list of them that fascinate me, and I'll just wind the clock forward. I think 10 years from now. I'll hypothesize that there will be things that we can physically implant in our body that collect all this data for us at a much more granular level. That the feedback loops we have between the data and actionable activity, based on not just data that's collected from individuals, but that's data collected across huge swaths of demographics, will be very, very powerful, and we'll be able to create closed loop feedback systems that allow us as human beings to help manage and adjust our behavior and our health as a result of all of this data. Again, do a 20 or 30-year science fiction experiment. Read about in 2050. Really, we think that in 2050 we're still going to be dealing with diabetes by having an insulin pump that we have to check a number on and then press a button. Really? Come on.
Yeah.
So I think we're in the middle of an enormous invention cycle and innovation cycle around that. That's not just hardware, and it's not just software, and it's not just medical devices, and it's not just data, and it's not just understanding human physiology, and it's not just understanding the brain. And it's not just having software layers that you can build on quickly to try things. It's all of that. And it's the fact that all of that is happening in parallel, which is so exciting to me as an investor.
Okay. Well, Brad, before we conclude, I definitely want people to connect with you, at least follow your updates. I mean, how do you recommend people follow you, connect with you?
I write a blog pretty much daily, not every day. I'm not obsessed about it, but pretty much daily at feld.com. My Twitter feed is @bfeld. All the books that I write and the stuff around the books that I write is at a site called startuprev.com. Foundrygroup.com is what my partnership venture side, and then of course TechStars is another organization that we're very, very deeply involved in. So those are probably the best places to find stuff about what's going on with me and my world.
Okay.
And if people want to interact with me directly, I try to respond to all the email I get. I'm sure I'm not 100% perfect at it, but I try pretty hard. I'm Brad at Feld.com, and my only request is imagine a person who gets 500 emails a day and tries to respond to them all. So keep it short, start with a punchline, be direct about what I can do to engage with you.
Okay, well, Brad, thank you very much.
All right, Ash.